you. This is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. So, kind of the opening words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So let us turn now to 172 in your hymnal. And basically, this is a hymn that echoes those Beatitudes. couldn't not sing that song with that particular biblical passage. Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese monk who was forced to flee Vietnam during the Vietnam War and eventually has made his way back there as he nears death, wrote in a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ a statement that I think is very true. He said, when Jesus said, "I am the way," he meant that to have a true relationship with God, you must practice his way. If you only satisfy yourself with praising a name, even the name of Jesus, it is not practicing the life of Jesus. We must practice living deeply, loving and acting with charity if we wish to truly honor Jesus. The way is Jesus himself, and not just some idea of him. When we understand and practice deeply the life and teaching of Jesus, he continues, we penetrate the door and enter the abode of the living Christ, and life eternal presents itself. The same basic lesson or principle is reflected in a familiar phrase that you all know that was made popular from a novel from the late 1800s. What would Jesus do? Right? WWJD. People wear bracelets with that on it. And of course there are new versions, right? I saw one the other day that said, what would Jesus tweet? A good question. The book is pretty sentimental, typical of the late 1800s, but the question is pretty powerful, right? Because that question has persisted in popularity for over 100 years. And the question challenges us to connect faith to daily life. It challenges us to see following Jesus as actually following Jesus in terms of how he lived and how he loved. The question works. That's why it's still floating around. How should the carriers of the sacred, how should those who would follow Jesus live? And every time I think about that question, my mind goes to the Beatitudes. I think that the Beatitudes are kind of Jesus' replacement of the Ten Commandments. Greg Carey, who's a professor of New Testament studies at Lancaster Seminary, talked about the Beatitudes in a blog once, and I found his words interesting. There were two sentences that jumped out at me, and the first sentence was this: these blessings begin with 4 groups of people nobody wants. Or, to put it another way, with 4 groups of people nobody wants to be or join. Now think about that, especially in light of a lot of what's going on in our world today, right? Jesus places his blessing in these Beatitudes on those people the world wants to reject. The poor, the hungry, the grieving, the excluded. Places his blessing on the very kind of people most of us do not want to be. The second sentence goes like this: Jesus' next 4 blessings apply to people who live the values he proclaims: the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who suffer persecution for the cause of justice. So if we would be followers of Jesus in terms of how we are to live, the Beatitude points us to 2 things. First, it encourages us, it asks us to be people who value and encourage and accept the people who the world doesn't value, encourage, and accept. And it encourages us to accept ourselves when we are being, too often, in situations the world does not encourage, value, and accept. The second thing that it asks us to do is to be people whose lives are marked with compassion, honesty, acceptance, and a willingness to stand for justice for the poor, hungry, grieving, and excluded, even when it's difficult. Even, in fact, when it's costly. When it leads to use the words of the Beatitudes, persecution. Now, I'm going to suggest that these two things are really important for us to think about as we go through our days. Am I a person who's willing to value all people, even those often rejected by the world? And, secondarily, what are the kinds of qualities that mark my life? Am I merciful? Am I authentic? Am I a person who stands up for what is right? Is my life patterned after that of Jesus? We seek, I think, all of us, to live lives worthy of Jesus, to live lives worthy of the sacred. We want to follow Jesus. We want to be in the way. We want to be like the one who lived the way of the sacred. And now we have this guideline in the Beatitudes. Value ourselves, value others, even when it's difficult. Stand up for good things, be merciful. But it's not an easy thing, is it? Because what's happening is the world is pulling us a different direction. Way too often. This way of approaching life goes against the way that often we are encouraged to think. These are not the values we see playing out in our society. In one of his essays, J.B. Phillips rewrote the Beatitudes, and he wrote them according to the world. Now, J.B. Phillips was a biblical scholar, translator, author, clergyman from England, and his translation of the New Testament, the J.B. Phillips translation of the New Testament, is my favorite translation of the New Testament. When I was in college, in fact, it was hot. Every college student I ever knew was reading the J.B. Phillips version of the New Testament. So here are his Beatitudes of the world. Happy are the pushers, for they get on in the world. Happy are the hard-boiled, for they don't let life hurt them. Happy are those who complain, because they get their way in the end. Happy are the blasé, for they never worry about anything. Happy are the knowledgeable, for they know their way around. Happy are the troublemakers, for they make people take notice of them. I started thinking about J.B. Phillips' list, and it struck me that all the elements in his list are about two things: protection and power. More specifically, about the use of power to keep oneself safe and to give oneself dominance, to get what one wants. And what is missing in that particular set of Beatitudes is a regard for the other. Just not there. And so what we have in the Beatitudes of the world that J.B. Phillips gives us is what I call essential selfishness. Essential selfishness. And believe me, there's a lot of forces pulling us toward essential selfishness. Fear pulls us toward essential selfishness. The desire to have power or wealth pulls us toward essential selfishness. Resentment pulls us toward essential selfishness, where we think about ourselves and we are willing to do whatever it takes to protect ourselves, to benefit ourselves, and we just set other people off to the side in our consideration. But these 8 principles offered by Jesus in the Beatitude, that's a whole different picture. It's a whole different thing. And these 8 principles separate the way of the children of God from the way of the world. One author puts it this way. In the Beatitudes, Jesus is challenging people to a new and better standard of living. He does not say, if you follow these principles, you will be a Christian. Rather, he says, because you're a Christian, you will follow these principles. I would change that a little bit. Because we need to move in our heads the Beatitudes out of the role of being a new set of commandments that we can't keep. Anybody here keep all the 10 commandments every day of their life? So here's the way I would like to think about it. Instead of seeing these as commandments, I want us to see these as promises. I want us to see these as promises. Christ is promising us that as people who are filled with and awake to the Spirit, we can live this way. We can live this beatitude way, this blessed way, because we carry the sacred with us every day, every moment, into every situation. And that sacred presence gives us the power to live this way. So when we struggle with want, with the Spirit, we can, instead of losing hope, find hope. When we face grief, with the Spirit, instead of falling into despair, we can find comfort. When we are surrounded by the abuse of power and by injustice, we can remain rooted in justice and in the way of God, and continue to be open and kind, and strive to do what is right. Because we carry the sacred in us, and it's alive and well and active, we can be people of mercy and authenticity, and we can be peacemakers who don't fan the flames of enmity, but instead create reconciliation and healing. The Beatitudes remind us that we can do life a different way, the Jesus way. Pastor Carl Vaders once noted, "I have never heard anyone complain that Christians act too much like Jesus. Even the angriest, most anti-God person will complain that the problem with Christians is that we don't act enough like Jesus." The Beatitudes are a promise that we can act more like Jesus. Because when we are connected with God, something happens. We become, to use the first word of these sentences, these verses, we can become blessed. Now, what does the word blessed mean, by the way? The word is makarios in Greek. Honestly, there's no good translation for it. It means happy, kind of. It means fortunate, lucky, kind of. It means given favor, kind of. But it's really a complex word that has elements of all of those words. But if we're trying to understand what blessed means, it basically means that you have experienced God's love. To be blessed means that you have experienced God's love and grace. So we can experience the presence. We can live the presence. We can become people who have experienced God's love and grace and have allowed that love and grace to make us people who live love and grace. And one of the ways that we really get to that presence, experience that love and grace, one of the places where we are blessed is right here at the table. Communion is one place where presence is shouted out loud, where we pick up the bread and we taste the cup, and we take God in. The table is a place where that transforming presence can be awakened and nurtured and made real. In the meal, we tangibly take what is necessary for life into ourselves and remember that we are carriers of the sacred. We remember that we are blessed. Blessed in that we can overcome the worst the world has to offer. Blessed in that in spite of what happens to us and around us, we can remain compassionate and authentic. Blessed so that we are people who do not add to the ills of this world, but overcome them. So let us, blessed children of God, come to the table of grace. As we prepare to come to the table. Let's join together in singing hymn 500.